Thanks so much, Eleanor. Thanks for the invitation. It's really, it's a great privilege. I mean, you know this as well as I do, better maybe, that just to have a day to think about something like this in a focused way with other people involved is really a great privilege. So I really appreciate the invitation. When I was at Notre Dame, I was once on a committee. I think it was a committee on research. You hear me in the back? Okay.
Oh, you've got a mic, is it on?
It's not that kind of mic, right? It doesn't. Is it?
Oh.
It's just for the camera. Let me move this up. I'll move up a little. It's a committee on research, I think. And, much better? Good, good, good. So it's a committee on research, and somebody said, somebody in classics, I think, said, I don't know why they call this research what we do. It's scholarship. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know what I do. It's not research and it's not scholarship. You think about stuff, I don't know. You know? So after these two talks that were terrific and scholarly, here I go. So on Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day of the Jewish year, the rabbi comes into the synagogue, stands before the ark, the holy ark where the Torah is kept, and says, throws himself on the floor and says, "Oh Lord, I'm nothing." And then the cantor, the guy who does the prayer, who actually sings the prayers, sees this. So he comes in, throws himself on the floor before the holy ark and says, "Oh Lord, I'm nothing." And then the janitor, guy who takes care of the place, sees this going on and thinks, okay, I guess this is what you're supposed to do. So he comes in, stands before the holy ark, throws himself on the floor and says, "Oh Lord, I'm nothing." And the rabbi elbows the cantor and says, "Look who says he's nothing." That's my humility joke. One more story. This is a story about Rabbi Soloveitchik, who was the leader of a kind of modern orthodoxy in the 20th century, and kind of a hero of David, mine, and lots of people. And there's a story about him that goes something like this, that a student comes to him and asks a question about piety. The Yiddish word he used was frum. And Rabbi Soloveitchik says, we're not into piety. For us, it's all about spiritual refinement. And I think that's a very important comment. The word he uses is a German Yiddish word, edel. That is, it's a kind of refinement that we're after. And I think that has a lot to do with, I think it has a lot to do with what we're going to be talking about. Okay, the conference is on intellectual humility, but thinking about that, I wasn't sure what to do with it other than to think about humility particularized to the cognitive domain or something like that. So let's come back to it later. I really want to think about humility. Now, in the talk, the first talk today, about the Muslim tradition, there was a lot about a kind of negative quality to humility. I'm not saying it right. It has to do with the feeling and the thought that I'm somehow less than. I compare myself to other people. I think about my relation to God, and I feel, in some sense, rather lowly. That was seemed to be the heart of the idea, or near the heart of the idea, or something like that. Right, so there are two features of that I want to think about. One of them is that I'm at the center of attention, and secondly, that I'm the center of attention in a negative sort of way. So I looked around the web just for definitions of what people said about humility, and I found things like that. The act, one source said the act or posture of lowering oneself in relation to others. Another thing I saw was a modest or low view of one's own importance. I taught a course last year on Rudolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy. It's Rudolf, right? I did that because I didn't know the book well enough, and I thought this is something I need to know, so I want to see what's going on. People say it's the source. And in some ways I didn't like it, in other ways it really paid off. One of the things he talks about, and I think this is an aspect of humility on his view, is what he calls creature consciousness. He says it's the emotion of a creature abased and overwhelmed by its own nothingness. This is like the nothing joke. In contrast to that which is supreme above all creatures. So abased is a strong word, right? And he finds one biblical source for this sort of idea, others too, but one that he highlights and that made a big dent on me, which is from the Akedah, the story about Isaac and Abraham and the commandment to kill Abraham's son. And Abraham, as you know, actually before that, it's chapter 18, it's a couple chapters earlier, where he's arguing with God about people have mentioned it already this morning, about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And that God has a plan to destroy these cities, but he says, I have to check with Abraham first, which is interesting. And how can I do this without consulting my beloved Abraham? And then Abraham is stunned that God's going to do this. Seems crazy. And he says very strong things. How can the judge of all the earth kill the righteous with the sinners? And it's a kind of wild discussion, right? I mean, it starts with 50 people and then it goes down to 40, and then Abraham is, should I say it? Jewing him down. What? Handling is the homeboy phrase for this, right? And along the way, he says, after he wins one or two rounds, he says, who am I to argue with you? This is crazy. I'm but dust and ashes. And Otto uses that to get you focused on the dust and ashes feeling, the sense of being abased, the sense of being nothing, low. And it struck me as really wild, because when I read that, it was like the chair arguing with the dean for money. You say all kinds of things, right? It didn't strike me as an existential moment of deep lowliness at all. Actually didn't. Yeah. So this is reminiscent for me of discussions about awe. So I've thought about awe a bunch, and there's certainly something that's often accompanied. We talked about this before a little bit. Often accompanied is an accompaniment of awe. I used to think it was at the heart of it, but Harry Frankfurt told me he doesn't feel this way, so I changed my mind.
He doesn't feel humility in any circumstances, and probably not.
You said that.
I'm going to say you said it, actually.
It's like the other story.
But I was here.
So when you're awestruck by something, you're humbled. You feel humbled. And when I thought about this, it was rather important to me that humbled is not humiliated. Humble doesn't mean, for me, lowly. Now, I don't mean to kind of refute the other way of looking at all of this, but just to tell you about my own sensibility and see if it's resonant for you. So humbled, I think of like when you're awestruck by something. You know, let it be a piece of music, or let it be the Grand Canyon, or whatever it is. You're kind of stunned by it, and you're humbled in the sense that you lower your eyes, and you feel like you're in the presence of the holy, or something like that, right? Okay, now these ways of looking at these topics are not congenial for me. I don't really feel this way. And Doug, where's Doug? Doug? There you are. Before asked David, I think, he asked whether maybe, or is it a possibility, or no, you asked in the first session, I think. You asked whether there were whether there was anybody in the Muslim tradition who thought about humility in a way that wasn't comparative, right? And that connects a lot to where I want to go, okay? Because I feel like when I have that feeling of being in the presence of something holy, I don't feel lowly. I don't feel like I'm comparing myself to anything. So that's what I want to think about. I want to think about, is there a way that we can think about humility that doesn't involve comparative judgments or lowliness? It reminds me a bit of the concept of the fear of God that's biblical, right? And in Hebrew, the word is yirah, which means both fear and awe. And I used to wonder about why in the world being afraid was supposed to be a virtue, right? The beginning of wisdom. And I never got it. And then I read Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who's a really interesting character, who talks about awe. He doesn't talk about fear, really. And awe experiences in their most intense form are scary. And you can imagine awe at God, at Job's meeting God, or whatever it is. So it's a kind of interesting kind of phenomenon. And when I thought about it, I saw in it two things. I saw in it a sense of being humbled and a sense of being elevated all at once. And that's very striking to me. Those two don't often go together. Okay, but humbled wasn't humiliated. Okay, so now I want to think about humility and see how to do it. So the text is a biblical text that's we all know and is very striking in this way, if I can find it. It's in Micah. We call him Micha. It's famous chapter 6, verse 8. You said that? Shh. I told you, scholarship.
We did this in
Yeah.
advance.
I think this is the King James. I'm not sure. It hath been told thee, O man. In the Hebrew, it's very humble and different. Humble. It's very humble. It says, Higid lecha adam. It's been said to you, been told to you, man, human being, ma tov, what is good, uma adonai doresh mimecha, what God wants from you, ki masos, but only to do justice and love chesed, which I don't know how to translate exactly. It says mercy, but it's not mercy. It's kind of loving kindness.
That's the usual.
Yeah. V'hatznei aleches im Elohecha, and walk humbly with your God. That's how it's usually translated. Okay, this seems like a central text for me. It's kind of interesting because it obscures the difference between modesty and humility, because the Hebrew word is usually translated as modest, to walk modestly with your God. But I don't think it matters here. I think somehow, first of all, humbly modifies walking, to walk humbly with God. So I like this a lot because it has to do with the way you walk around the world, the way you do things, it's sort of the way you are in the world, the way you live. It's not just an attitude in this, or a feeling or a thought, and it's not just behavioral. It's an enacted attitude. In this way, it's a lot like faith, I think, where faith in the sense not of belief, but faith in the sense of a kind of stance towards the world. Okay, we can come back to that. So faith is something I'm thinking about a bunch. So that's what I want to do. I want to figure out how what the stance or what the walking is like. So I went to Yeshiva University, the place that David teaches, and as an undergraduate, and I hadn't been exposed to religion before at all in my life, really. And I took to it in a very powerful way at the beginning. My parents wanted me to go there because they thought it would straighten me out, but they didn't expect what they got. So I became an Orthodox Jew, and I had, after a few years of sort of preparatory work, I had this Talmud teacher who affected my life in tremendously important ways. His name was Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein. So he's a PhD in literature from Harvard. He published a book and then dropped out of that world completely and works on Talmud. That's what he does. And he's an amazing character to be with, to pray near, to talk to. And I've kept up with him. He's now old and ill. He lives in Jerusalem, or outside of Jerusalem. So I didn't go to Israel until 1990. And there was a conference in honor of David Kaplan, the famous philosopher of language. And I felt like I owed Kaplan a lot, and I wanted to go to this thing. And my wife, Barbara, wanted to go very much. And we took our kids. And so I called Rabbi Lichtenstein, who by that time lived there. And I said, was there a chance I could get to talk to you? Because I had dropped out of that world completely. I didn't tell you this part, but I entered the rabbinical program after 5 years of work as an undergraduate, and then had theological doubts and just dropped out completely. Dropped out of religious life as well as this thing that was going to be a kind of career. So I hadn't talked to him for years, and I called him and said, can I see you? He said, yes, come over with your whole family like 7 a.m. because I go to teach right after that. And we sat around his living room, and I tried to tell him how much he meant to me, because I felt like I learned to think in his class. It was really Talmud done in the way that these guys do it is just a mind-blowing, wonderful thing. And he couldn't hear. He didn't want to hear about it. He sat there with his eyes down and changed the subject. And I felt like I'm in the presence of something important here. This is really very special. So it's a virtue I want to understand better. Now, I have, as some of you know from Facebook, I have a grandson who's 7, who's a little miracle, and but he's struggling at the moment because he was an only child for 5 years, and then now he has a little brother who's 2, and he was the center of everybody's world, well, certainly ours, and it's hard for him now. And he doesn't take it out on his brother, but he takes it out on everybody else. And his mother, my daughter, our daughter, is working very hard on it. And what she's working hard on is developing a certain virtue. And the virtue, I feel like, is the thing we're talking about. Not intellectual humility only, but humility. And this is what the connection to spiritual refinement for me was. Think about humility as a kind of spiritual refinement. That doesn't have to be religious necessarily, but a kind of, imagine you're brought up in a way, your parents do a great job, and somehow it's unthinkable to you to make yourself the center of attention in ways that are not appropriate, right? I mean, you're really good at this. You care about it, it matters to you. It's not like you don't want to think about yourself ever or talk about yourself. It's not like you need to deny what your strengths are. In certain contexts, you'll talk about it when it's appropriate. But it's not your topic, it's not your thing in the world, it's not really what you want to do. When you see an old student who's very grateful to you, inside you're tremendously happy about that you had that kind of effect on somebody's life. But you know, let me hear what you're doing now. You know, it's a whole different thing. So that's kind of my picture. And I want to embellish it somewhat now. I once had a talk with Bob Adams about the problem of evil, and we were talking about what I think he called the practical problem of evil, the existential problem of evil, something like that, which meant something like not the theoretical problem of how to put together these features of God, but rather how to live in the world given how hard it is and how that affects faith and affects. And he told me he had a broad conception of a religious person, which was surprising to me because I was at Notre Dame and I heard him talk about things that were scary to me. It didn't sound broad at all, right? I mean, I said this to you before, yesterday, I think. He once talked about, he gave a talk in which he said, we are so deeply bad that nothing we do can be worthy of reward, so that all reward is grace. And I thought, whoa, I don't want my kids to hear this, you know. I don't mean to put that down. Maybe, you know, there are religious views that maybe I don't share. There are ways to think about these things that this would not be the conference to be presumptuous, right? So I don't want to put it down. I just mean it was crazy to me. I couldn't get a hold of it. And then I used to see him afterwards, and when I taught at Riverside, he was at UCLA, and I used to go talk to him about religion a lot. He was very generous, and the whole spirit was really different. I once sat next to him at a dinner, and I was just coming back to religious life, and I said, I want to ask you about prayer. So when I read the Psalms, it's all metaphorical to me because I can't take literally some of this stuff. And you probably think that isn't prayer at all. And he said, it's the real thing. And I thought, whoa, that's interesting. So he told me he had a conception of a religious person that wasn't about theism. It was about making awe and love central values in your life. And he told me he thought of anybody who thinks that way as religious spirited person. And I like that a lot. I once gave a talk at the APA or at some conference. He was there, and I had to check with him because I thought, did he really say that, or is it just me? But he did. So I think of this kind of humility as certainly not necessarily religious in a theistic sense, but maybe not even religious in his broad sense. That is, imagine that you develop these traits in this way of dealing with people and the world and your abilities. And it's not much because of awe and love. It's just who you are. It's the way you were brought up. It's just completely natural to you. I can imagine such a thing. Okay? But I think faith deepens the humility, potentially. And I want to talk about some of the ways in which that happens. What time do I have until? Because
You have a full hour.
when do we start? Oh, 2:30. Good, I used up a half. I'm worried about having too little to say instead of too much. This is a very hard topic for me. I don't know, so we'll see. So how does faith deepen the humility? Well, one thing is that other people have spoken about this already, about the sense that you might have of your own abilities and the things you have in life as gifts. Okay? If you think that way, it's pretty powerful. It's really wonderful. I keep telling stories, but I'll keep going. There was a guy in Israel who was a hero of mine named Rabbi Mickey Rosen. He was very devout, but also very politically sensitive and sensitive to the needs of Palestinians. He was for me, he was just a fantastic guy. And he died about 3 years ago of a degenerative disorder. And I would walk around the streets with him, just taking walks, and somebody would come up to him, and he didn't have much time left, and somebody would come up to him and say, how you doing? And he'd say, Kosi Ravaya, which means my cup runneth over. And he felt like it was all a gift. And it's a very powerful thing. And so that's humility. Right? Where you don't get puffed up about the things you have or the things you are. You don't deny them, but you don't get puffed up about it. I think this is also available to people who aren't theistic. You might think not. You might think, well, you know, who gave you the gift? Right? But I don't think so. I used to argue with Plantinga about whether it's coherent to feel grateful without anybody to be grateful to. And I thought, clearly it is. I mean, I felt like clearly it is. He thought clearly it isn't. But if you can be grateful, then you can feel like you're gifted, even though it's not exactly a gift somebody gave you. So we're tracking this down, and I think faith, as I say, deepens the humility. And the first way I talked about was gift, but when I think about it, it's sort of on the track to a religious attitude, but it doesn't have to be theistic, certainly. Now I want to move to a second kind of thing. This is a story about, there's a guy that I study Talmud with now. We're sort of study partners in Los Angeles, and he's a retired mathematician, a terrific guy. He's your brother-in-law. And he's too smart for me. It's very hard. Talmud is really hard, and he's got the kind of mind that latches on right away, and I have the kind of mind that I have to go over it 36 times until I really get it. And so he told me a story about his father. His father was a rabbi in Brooklyn, and once gave a sermon on this kind of topic of humility, and he raised the question of how in the world can the Bible say that Moses was the most humble of all men? After all, look at the connections with God he had. He had to have a deep grasp, even though he asked God for the keys, and God told him, no one can see my face, right? But he had to have a deep grasp, much deeper than ours, of God and people. And not at the beginning. At the beginning, he was probably self-abnegating, you'd say, or something. Right? He spoke about the fact that he couldn't speak and he didn't really want this job. But when he got into it, he doesn't seem humble in the conventional sense. He talks in Deuteronomy in ways that don't sound self, right? I mean, it's your fault that I can't get into the promised land, you know? So how could he be humble exactly, given what he knew about himself and the world? Especially if you think of humble on the other model, where humble means lowering yourself. So what this Rabbi Rabinowitz said in his talk, as reported to me by his son, was that when you start a new area of study, say you don't know much about mathematics and you start studying mathematics, by the time you're really into it, you're stunned by how much you don't know and how much there is to know. Much more than you were at the beginning. The beginning was all a blur. But when you really get into a subject matter in a serious way, you become sensitive to how amazing the field is in a way and how much there is to know. So he was thinking about intellectual humility, I think, and he was thinking about the fact that he had a deep appreciation for what he didn't know. And that was a product of how much he did know. This got me thinking, and I was thinking about Einstein, who, you know, if you think about curiosity, you're puzzled by certain things, and you might think so. When you get to when you get to the answers, you're not puzzled anymore. You're okay. It's like the fly is out of the fly bottle or something, right? But the truth is, the more Einstein knew, the more he's stunned by the world he was. The more he knew about the world, the more stunned by the world he was, and more stunned by how much more there was to know. So this connects to me with these thoughts about awe, right? Because it isn't just the intellectual humility of Moses that he understood how much there was to know. Sounds like Socrates too, right? Lahavdil. Never mind, I'll tell you the joke later. It wasn't that funny. So, it wasn't just the humility that's a product of a recognition of how much there is to know that you don't possess. I feel like it was the humility of being stunned by what you do know. and stunned by, I mean, here's this man who's this lowly shepherd or whatever he was, in touch with God. He must think about his own life and his own career and be stunned by it. Rather than be lowly about it, be stunned by how amazing it all is. And I can feel like when you have a student who shows gifts, if you the moments doesn't happen that much, but the moments at which you can feel the gifts of the student as something holy, right? Something that needs protection and development. That's the phenomenon I'm interested in. And it can be about yourself, not just about a student. You can look at your own abilities and your own accomplishments, your own family and your own things that, right? And feel stunned by it in a way that doesn't take away from it or make it lowly or anything like that at all. But not bragging about it. Not. Okay. Now the question is, what else do I have to say? I'm not sure, but I want to read a passage. There's a lot to say about all this. This is kind of just an introduction for me and to you, just with me, to this hard area. Let me see where we are. So I'm thinking if we leave early, we can get to the game on time. I'm kidding. Okay. So this is an odd reading. It's not the Bible. It's Bill Russell, okay, the basketball great, who wrote a book after he retired called Second Wind, in which I'm not even sure it's relevant to what we're talking about, but it struck me and I thought it's worth a shot. We got to do this. It's very exciting to me. Here's what he says. Every so often a Celtic game would heat up so that it became more than a physical or even mental game and would be magical. That feeling is difficult to describe, and I certainly never talked about it when I was playing. When it happened, I could feel my play rise to a new level. It came rarely and would last anywhere from 5 minutes to a whole quarter or more. 3 or 4 plays were not enough to get it going. It would surround not only me and the other Celtics, but also the players on the other team and even the referees. To me, the key was that both teams had to be playing at their peaks, and they had to be competitive. That mystical feeling never started with a hot streak by a single player or with a breakdown of one team's defense. It usually began when 3 or 4 of the 10 guys on the floor would heat up. They would be the catalysts. The feeling would spread to the other guys, and we'd all levitate. Then the game would just take off. And there'd be a natural ebb and flow that reminded you of how rhythmic and musical basketball is supposed to be. I'd find myself thinking, this is it. I want to keep this going. And I'd actually be rooting for the other team. When their players made spectacular moves, I wanted their shots to go into the basket. That's how pumped up I'd be. I'd be out there talking to the other Celtics, encouraging them and pushing myself harder, but at the same time, part of me would be pulling for the other players too. At that special level, all sorts of odd things happened. The game would be in a white heat of competition, and yet somehow I couldn't feel competitive, which is a miracle in itself. I'd be putting out the maximum effort, straining, coughing up parts of my lungs, and yet I never felt the pain. The game would move so quickly that every fake cut and pass would be surprising, and yet nothing could surprise me. It was almost as if we were playing in slow motion. During these spells, I could almost sense how the next play would develop and where the next shot would be. Even before the other team brought the ball in bounds, I could feel it so keenly that I'd want to shout to my teammate, it's coming there, except that I knew that would kill it if I did that. Okay, so he goes on a bit about this. I feel like it's like a humble... Here's this guy at the top of his game, the top of the world. I wish he was making a fortune, but back then probably not. And it's all like a gift. It's all like the way you can have a holy moment. These are holy moments. And he need not deny anything about his ability in his heart or in his words.